Okay, Ken sent me a few pictures to show you corrections on, and I think it's really good to go back and look at some basic image corrections and kind of evolve into some more complex ones as we go through and see the options that might be available to us. This first image is fairly low-res image, but we'll work with it as it is. And you can see it's a little overexposed in the faces. It has a totally whited out sky. The sky's overexposed. We don't have any real detail in it. And we've got this lovely bridal party, and let's do something with it that kind of makes it look a little bit better. Before we start, let's discuss really what's wrong with it. I mentioned already the sky is just blown out. What the photographer could have done was to use a little fill and flash here so that he could have used a smaller aperture, and that would have allowed him to bring the sky down a little bit and get some detail in it. It also would have given us a little bit more directional light, and that's part of the issue with this, is it's just kind of basically a wash and light without any direction at all. The dresses that are supposed to be a little bit green, from what I can gather, are just kind of all washed out, and there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of detail in the bride's dress at this exposure. So the first thing we want to do is go into our layers palette, and we want to make a copy of the layer. So I'm going to do Command J, I'm on the Macintosh, Control J if you're on the PC, and change this layer's blend mode from normal to multiply. That's kind of a first step in seeing how much we can bring the exposure down by just using a multiply layer. You can see it's darkening the grass quite a bit. The hair maybe got just a little too dark. The skin's just maybe a bit too dark too. So we're just going to take the opacity and ratchet it back to, let's try about 60%, looks like to me. Right about there. Maybe just a little bit darker. 66% looks pretty good for this particular image. Now if I'm worried about skin tones, I want to open up my window, open my info palette, come in here and run my cursor over some of the skin here. It looks like it's a little bit yellow, if anything. Yep, all of them. What I'm looking at right now is, if I run the cursor over here, look over at the CMYK channel representation. The cyan, magenta, and yellow are the measurements of how much of each of those colors are in the skin that I'm looking at, and the shoulder area should be just about the same as the bridge of the nose. If I were looking at a larger image, I'd be checking the bridge of the nose and possibly the chin. Those would be medium tone areas, not the shadows, not the highlights, and what we should have is a ratio where the magenta, being our base color, the cyan and the yellow are taken off of that color. The magenta should be 3 to 4 times what the cyan is. So the cyan, in other words, is a quarter to a third of what the magenta is. And in this case, it's right on the money at 1/3. The yellow should only be about 10 to 20% more than the magenta, and this is for adult Caucasian skin. It's going to change a bit if you have a guy with very ruddy complexion. If you have somebody that's extremely tan, obviously those numbers are going to be different. But just as a baseline, those are the ratios that we want to work with. The magenta is your baseline. The yellow should be 10 to 20% more. So if it's 27 in this case, that's almost 3. So it should be 3 to 6 percentage points more than the magenta in the yellow. In this case, it's 20 points more. So that means they're pretty yellow. So what we need to do is go into the curves layer. And what I'm going to do here is go back to the layers palette. I'm going to do this as an adjustment layer. So we've got some nice flexibility here. Go to curves, and we'll talk about the curves because this is essential for doing your image corrections. Both light-wise, we could have come in here first and done that rather than the multiply layer. It was just so vastly overexposed overall, a multiply layer gets you in the neighborhood quite quickly. Alright, so the curves dialog box. What we have here is the RGB, or the composite channel. If you pull up on this in the middle, it's going to increase the exposure or lighten the image. If we pull down, it's going to decrease the exposure or darken the image. If I pull in the center, it's going to focus more of that darkening or lightening power in the mid-range tones. If I let me just pull that off, and that's how you get rid of a point, just pull it off the graph. If I come down here in the darker tones, see in this area, that's representing the darker tones of the image, then I can actually put a second point here and just basically control the darker areas of this image. So I can bring that up, and you see, look at the tree area. I'm overdoing it just so you can see, but it's really, really pulling the detail out of those darker areas of the tree. And I can use my up-down arrow keys for a little bit more control. So I can bring that down so it really kind of isolates those darker areas here. That's one way to control the overall exposure of this image. If I were to do this end of this curve, that would pull down the brighter areas, and you can see even though I pull it down, I'm still not getting any detail up here to speak of. If I were going to brighten the brighter areas, that's how I do it. We're going to blow out the highlights in that bride's dress if we do that, so we want to leave that alone, essentially. Alright, now for color balance, we know this is a little bit on the blue side, on the yellow side, because our yellow was so much higher than it should have been. So what we want to do is add back in a little bit of blue. So I'm just going to take this and pull this up a little bit, and we want to once again look at our info palette and see how we're doing here. And that's quite a bit closer. There we go. So we've got really, really quite a bit closer there to what it should be. It's still a little bit off, so back to curves. Nope, that's not it. Sorry. Let's bring this back over here. I've got so many things in here. Okay, adjustments right there. Okay, so I may add just a little bit more blue to that and see how that looks with our skin tones. Okay, if we had something in there that was a nice medium grayscale, we can use the mid-range pointer, the mid-range sampler here. That's a color sampler for the mid, not the highlights, not the lowlights, but that one, and click on anything in here that we know is absolutely color neutral, and that would self-correct the image. The problem with that is unless you know it's absolutely neutral, you could get something like this, which has obviously gone way too magenta. So I'm going to undo that, Control Z or Command Z, and that to me looks pretty good. Let's do our info palette back here, pull it down here, and let's just double check. We've got, yeah, that's looking a lot better. That's very close. Okay, so we've got the skin tones balanced out there. We've got a little bit better exposure. I think what I want to do here is go back to the adjustments panel and see our RGB and just maybe bring that down just a touch to try and get a little bit more of the details in that dress. See, we've been able to bring back a little bit of the shadow detail there. And one more time, check our info palette here and just make sure we haven't fouled up our, yeah, we're doing much better here, much closer to what we should be. Okay, so that is a little bit about how to use curves. In the curves dialog box here, you've got the RGB channel for overall brightness and darkness. You've got a red channel. If you pull up, you're adding red. If you pull down on it, you're taking away red, which adds cyan. Cyan's that kind of bluish green. The middle one here between the red and blue, the green channel adds magenta or adds green, depending on which way you go. And the blue channel, it's either blue or yellow. So depending on what you need to do when you look at your info panel, you know which way to pull these sliders. If your midtones look pretty good, but your highlights tend to be the wrong color, you can freeze the midtones by putting a point right there and then pull up and down on the one end or the other end of the slider, the diagonal line here, to color correct your highlights or your shadows. Okay, so back to layers. All right, so we've got this looking pretty good. That's our original. That's our corrected image. I am going to munch this down. I'm actually going to leave that bottom layer. So I'm making a copy of the bottom layer. I'm shift clicking on those 3 layers, Control or Command E to put those all into one coagulated layer. So I've got, that's my after, that's my before. And you can see now that we're looking at it how yellow that skin tone was. It may have not been apparent to you prior to that, but we've lowered the exposure and we've color corrected the skin tone quite a bit here. Okay, now I want to, this is at 100%, so we're kind of zoomed in here. One of the other problems that we have here, aside from the sky, is if you look at the pose here, and this is just an aside to let you know a little bit about posing, since this is digital imaging and photography class. When you have an arm that closes across the body like that, it's going to make your models, whoever you're photographing, look heavier. If you open that arm up so there's space between the body and the arm, it's going to make your model look thinner. So one of the mistakes that this photographer made was not telling all of the girls to bend that elbow and get the arm just a little bit away from their body. If they had done that, this bride would look a whole lot thinner. She'd look much more elegant. So that straight arm down there is a no-no photographically. You want to think of humans, especially women, but pretty much most of the time, if it can bend, you want to bend it. Especially with women, so we should have the elbow bent, we should have the wrist bent, we should have the fingers bent, these kind of straight down arms, fingers, that's a no-no in photography. All right, this is a much more pleasing silhouette. This one girl got it right, and who knows why. She's either had a picture done before or she just got lucky, but she's the only one that actually is posed in the way that she should be posed. So the next thing we want to do is bring in some information for the sky. So I'm going to go open up a sky folder, and I happen to have a few on my file here. So let's go look at my skies. And this one looks like it might be a good one to work with. I'm not going to take a lot of time to look this stuff over. I'm going to select all, copy, that's Control or Command A, Control or Command C. I'm going to close the file and I'm going to paste it in. And I don't care that it doesn't match the profile at this point. Okay, now so that I can see what I'm doing, I'm just going to change the layer blend mode of this to darken. When I do that, I'll be able to see a lot of the shapes of what's going on. The sky is still overlaying the girls' gowns where it's darker than the gown, but at least now I know where the sky is, and I can move it around and see if I have a nicer area of sky to look at. And that's, to me, looking like it's kind of a semi-realistic sky. I could also, if I wanted its sky, you can move it any which way you want. I could transform it and move it around like that. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. Now, I don't want it going over top of the girls. I don't want it going into these bright highlight areas. So I'm going to make a layer mask. Second icon over, well, third icon over, sorry. It's the linking layers icon, the effects or the layer style icon, and then the next one is the layer mask icon. I'm going to make a layer mask. I'm going to hit the gradient tool, G for gradient, right over here. It's under the paint bucket if your paint bucket happens to be the one that's showing. And I'm going to drag a shortish gradient up, and that's going to give me a little sky above these girls. If I put that much sky in, it's probably going to look a little bit weird. So I'm going to drop the opacity down just a bit. I just want a hint of sky so that it doesn't look like it's completely blown out. Now notice this layer is in darken mode. when I look at the tree here, the tree is darker than any of the pixels in the sky, so the tree is going to show through without any kind of selection process at all, saving me a ton of time in trying to select the tree. That would be a kind of a pain in the neck selection to make. Right here we've got one spot where the bride's bouquet is getting obliterated by the sky, so what I want to do here is I want to just take my brush tool in black and I want to get rid of the sky. I'm going to put it at 50% so I can slowly do it and just kind of bend that sky right around that. Okay, and I'm going to and you may end up wanting to just put a little bit of dabble sky right back in around it a little bit, just so you kind of blend it in a little bit better. It's all about watching the details and making sure that you don't do anything that's easily seen as a retouch by somebody in your viewer's audience. Okay, so there we go. So we have some sky there, and I could even drop that down just a little bit more. We just want a hint of sky, and the less we've got there, the less we've got as a hint of sky, the easier it is to not have to be too fussy about it. Okay, once you've got that the way you want it, you can, what I want to do here is set the history palette, so I've got a snapshot of this before I scrunch the layers down. Now Control or Command E, and there again, there's my before, there's my after. So we've got a whole lot more detail there. Okay, so that's your basic image retouching on this one. If it had more pixels in it, I would definitely sharpen it. And one of my favorite ways to sharpen something, make a copy of the layer that you need to sharpen, go up to Filter, Other, High Pass. I tend to use a setting of about 10 on this, and then change that layer blend mode to overlay, and you can see how over sharpened it is right now. But even though it's over sharpened, we don't have any haloing going on here. So what you want to do, because of the fact that it is vastly over sharpened, especially for a low res JPEG, is bring down the opacity until it's pleasing to you. So I would bring this down quite a bit, probably. That to me looks pretty good. That's at 25%. Don't take this as biblical. This is just a guideline. What you want to do is do this specifically for every image. So your image may need to be at 50% in this layer. It may need to be at 20%. Look at your image and then decide. So once again, I'm going to merge that down. Okay. Now, the other thing I want to show you, and I'm going to make a copy of our retouched layer and work on that. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to show you how much better her arm would look if she had been posed correctly. And this is a little overkill for possibly just basic retouching, but if I were going to do this retouching in a serious way for a bride's album to really make this look the best it could, then I would come in and use the pen tool and go around this. It would be definitely a lot easier if we had more pixels. We are going to end up probably having a little bit of an issue here because you can see how quickly it goes to jaggies because it is the low res image. I'm at 528 magnification, 528% of what the image should be seen at, in other words. Okay, so and the reason I'm doing the pen tool on this one rather than using one of our really nice selection tools, I'm going to hit the Command and Return key to turn that into a selection. The reason I'm doing that is because it's so low res, it won't select very well in using our selection tools. It will select much better if I'm actually just forcing it to be selected in the right way. I'm going to copy and paste that to a new layer, Command or Control J, and there's my arm right there. Okay? Okay, so I've got my arm. I'm going to name this arm layer. I'm going to come in here and do puppet warp on this one. What that does is it gives me a mesh around the arm, and I'm just going to put in a couple of points here. Let's see if it'll let me put this one in. Sometimes you have to be far enough away. Yep, okay, that may do it anyway. Alright, so I'm going to just drag, and you're seeing the layer underneath here, which is just fine, and I'm going to drag that. And then hit return, come over here, and there, we can go like that. Now, I can come in the layer below, use the clone tool. I'm going to say use current layer only, and I can come in here and zoom out just a touch, and I'm using it at 100% now, and clone out that arm from underneath. So I've got basically her curved arm, which doesn't look great at this point, but I'll fix that. Not to worry. Okay, so we've got her coming up like that. Alright. I don't want to add weight to her, so what I'm going to do is take the pen tool and shape her the way I believe she should be shaped. Remember, I'm on the layer underneath the arm, so the arm is above this layer. That's why I can't really do anything to the arm. The arm is above that layer. Alright, so I'm on the layer below. I can come over here and copy that wall and put that in behind her. Okay, and even down here in this position. And I might want to do something like pull that color up there just to make it a little less apparent. Okay, and you see the different pose there? It starts to make her look a little bit thinner. Okay, I'm going to go up to liquify because this is another one of those retouching techniques that can definitely help. Cancel. Oh, that's a good point. The reason that went up like that is because I have sky that's way over the edges in this image. So in order to cut down my file size, I want to do a select all, go up to image, and crop. Okay, now when I deselect, go up to filter and liquify, now I'm just seeing the girls here, and I'm not seeing all that extra sky. It's cropping on, it's doing the work on this layer, which is why I don't see the arm. But all I'm doing is taking and tucking in this little area where she's kind of been distorted by something that came in from behind her, making her look heavier. So I just want to tuck her in a little bit here. Give her a better waistline. Okay? And if I wanted to, and you don't want to do too much, it's better to use the clone tool than do too much tucking this way because it's going to distort pixels if you do too much. Okay, so click OK, and there we go. There's our bride looking quite a bit thinner. Now, the elbow does not look quite right. Puppet warp is great, but it doesn't quite get it exactly. So we already know this girl, it's pretty flat lighting. So even though she's facing the other direction, I think it's going to work out pretty well lighting-wise. I can come over here and take a little bit of her elbow here. I just really need the elbow part. And I'm going to bring that over here. Hit the command and the return or the control and the enter key. I'm going to feather it just a tiny bit. Select, refine, feather, and put in a very tiny feather. 0.3 pixels is fine. And then copy and paste it on a new layer. Okay. And then move it. There we go. And flip it. Transform, flip horizontal. Okay. And let's put it above, that layer above, and you see where we start to get an elbow that looks like it's a little bit more in line with what it should be. Okay. Remember, it's on its own layer. So once we get that in there, we can decide exactly how big it should be. And because that arm is on its own layer too, I can come in here and click on that and move it up to the right position to hit that. Okay, a little more clone work and we are all set. So that gives our bride a much better profile. She looks much thinner in this one. I am going to show you the one that I actually spent just a little bit more time on, and it's on my desktop, and you can see the result here. Oh, and it definitely needs to be color corrected a little bit more. We're used to looking at that other one, so let's go back in and do that again. And color correction, get some of the yellow out, get these girls looking the right color. There we go. Nice. Okay, so that is with just a little bit more finesse, making that arm look good, and adding the sky in, making our picture look a little bit better. So key things to remember are the curves can be used for color correction as well as overall exposure and contrast. If I were to make this an S-shaped curve, if I were to bring up on this end and bring down on this end, we're adding contrast. If I were to bring up on that end and down on this end, we're decreasing contrast. We're making it flat. So, and to get rid of these points, just drag them off the line and it'll bring it back to your starting point. Okay, so that is the before and after of our bridal picture with some basic retouching. Okay, I'm going to close that out and save it. Don't save. Okay. Okay, the other picture that I was asked to look at is this one. This is Roger's hockey picture. Well, this is a Andover hockey image. Those uniforms are supposed to be blue. As you can see, if we zoom in here, there's a lot of noise. This is a perfect example of noise in an image. Look at all that noise. It's all choppy looking. We've got a whole bunch of different colors in the areas where it should be kind of smooth gradient, smooth transition from one color to the other. We've got actually the lettering on the uniforms is about the best that any of this image looks. What happens is the photographer has a couple of options here. This image probably was taken too far away for their flash to work, and I'm sure the hockey players wouldn't appreciate flashes going off in their eyes while they're trying to score as well. So, and it also is fast moving. So the photographer has to basically use a high ISO to freeze the action and allow for the exposure to come in at a reasonable amount of light hitting your sensor. So he's ending up with a lot of noise in this, and I think it was a little underexposed as well because their faces look fairly dark. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to move over here. I've got a whole bunch of different ways that this can be corrected, options that we can correct this as. This is basically just pumping up the exposure on this, and that's using curves, as I showed you last time, where we come in, adjustments, let's go into here, curves, and pull up on the slider, and that allows us to change the exposure in this. If the whites weren't white, if the blacks weren't black, we may want to go into levels first. So if you go into the levels dialog box and, oh sorry, we're on an adjustment layer so it doesn't have any idea what we're doing here. If we go down here and go into the levels dialog box, you can see that actually the whites aren't really kind of hitting the end, so we could bring this over, and the black areas, if we have blacks, we can bring that over as well. Okay? So that's setting the white point and the black point. What that does is, anything, if you bring it inside of this, it's going to start clipping the whites, meaning this white area in here is going to lose detail. So we don't want to bring it inside those start of those pixels. This is a map of where the pixels lie in the image. We want to keep outside of where the pixels are mapped, but you can bring it right up to the edge. So that's pretty much what we want to do to get a full tonal range from a white white to a black black. And the black blacks are going to be these guys, pants probably, their skates, right in this area, those look pretty black. Okay? If you, then we can bring in our layers, and we can go into doing adjustments as far as color corrections and changing the contrast. So if we need a little bit more of the detail in those uniforms, we want to get the blue looking a little bit bluer, then we want to pull up on the lower end of the curve so that we can see that those uniforms are blue. And suddenly we've got a little bit of a differentiation between the blackness of those pants and the blue of the uniform here. So that makes a big difference. Okay. So back to layers. That is one of our options. All right. We can also come in here. I'm going to, once again, I'm just going to go in here and put those all together because we've done some corrections. One of the other things we can do, if you look in here, I use the surface blur to kind of bring down the noise factor on the skin. And that allows you, he's our center of attention, this guy right here. We're not all that concerned about these guys. We could probably do a little bit of work with him, but this guy is our center of attention. He's got the puck. He's the one with the action going on around him. So we can use surface blur and just paint it back in with our history palette. So the way we would do that is come in here, go to blur, surface blur. We want to zoom into that face to see what it's doing to the face. And you can see as we change the radius, and the threshold, the radius is the distance, and the threshold is the difference. So the distance from one pixel, one change of color to the other is controlled by the radius, and the threshold is the difference in color between one pixel and another. So the higher the threshold, the more pixels are going to be blended together. The lower the threshold, the fewer pixels. So we want to kind of control that, and we look at the area that's most important in doing that. And you can also use your up-down arrow keys to kind of change that. So I'm going to kind of assume that's going to be pretty good right there. Looks okay to me. And there's our basic color correction, our basic correction for smoothing out the skin of our main character and kind of bringing the blue out in the uniforms while making sure we still have black in the other team's uniforms. So that's a real basic one. If we want to get into some different stuff on top of that, then we could kind of crop it differently. This one is cropped right into that player, and then I used a lens blur to blur out the other players. Okay, so in order to, and again using the history palette to do that, or well, let me show you how to do that. All right, so come in here, I want to use a blur, lens blur, and on this one, again, it's what you see is what you get. The radius, the higher the number, the more blurry it's going to be. So you can choose as much blur as you want. Okay, so I'm going to put it right about there. And don't worry about the fact we're blurring our main character in this one. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to open my history palette. Now the history palette, we're back at surface blur for where we're going to paint our main character. So we're starting from lens blur. That's where the name is highlighted. That's the state that we're starting from. The state that we're painting from is the one where the paintbrush is next to it, the history paintbrush. We're going to go over, choose our history brush. I'm at 100% because I want it to be fully in focus. And I'm just going to paint back in our main character. Wherever I paint, it's going to be back that one step. Wherever I don't paint, it's going to be blurred, the lens blur. And if I wanted it to blend slowly from one to the other, I can use a softer edge brush, and or lower opacity brush. So if we want to just highlight this guy, we just paint around him, and that suddenly makes him a very, very strong focal point in this image. And then I could crop it in and do whatever I want as far as cropping goes, to highlight the fact that he's the main character in this image. If it's too much, if you feel that you've blurred it too much, remember you can copy from this one state of history. Select all, copy. I'm actually copying and pasting the layer, but I'm going back to surface blur, paste it above it, and then just lower the opacity. So go back to layers, there it is pasted above, and I can lower the opacity and see we can kind of blend those guys in a little bit if you think that's too much. I happen to like it a little bit more, but you know, and that's the even more fully affected. Bring it down. Let's zoom right into that guy. In this version, I added a little bit more highlight. I dodged the area on one side of the face and burned it down, so we've got a little bit more directional light going on. It's just a little bit more dramatic. In this version, that's pretty much what you saw, with him a little bit more brightly highlighted. In this version, that's with them before and after blurring out the background. And this version we cropped in a little bit more vertically so that he has less ice in front of him. I felt we kind of needed the glove of the goalie here to realize how close he is to scoring a goal, and it's nice to have the other action around him, how close he is as far as pursuit goes by the other players. And in this one there, it's cropped in and the other players are in focus. So there's any number of ways that you can manipulate this image in order to create different effects. But the surface blur, when you're dealing with noise in the skin, that's a nice tool to be able to use. Curves to be able to isolate different areas as far as what needs to be corrected to make the suits the right color, to get the right contrast, to get the right color balance in the skin, etc., etc. So that is what we're dealing with this image. Again, curves, and I've got a curves layer in here that I've used, and I just put in all the different layers to show you various options that we could have used in this image. I'm going to stop for a second and take a break, and we'll be back.